Okay, my presentation is on the War of 1812. So I am Specialty Area 18, so you'll want to open your workbook to page 55, and you'll be answering the questions as you go. Down at the bottom I have an example, so the stuff you'll write down will be in a different color and will be bolded just so it's easier to see, and you'll be able to write it down quickly. So the main purpose: what were the causes, course, and consequences of the War of 1812, and how did the War of 1812 prove the United States was a legitimate nation? So I will be talking about those both as we go through. So the first topic is impressments. British and the Americans were involved in this, and the French were kind of involved because on the left I have some background about the Napoleonic Wars. So Britain and France were currently in the Napoleonic Wars, and this caused impressments because Great Britain did not have enough supplies to defend against France. So prior to the French Revolution, which was in 1789, they had always had monarchs, and now they had a new government that wasn't very stable, and it brought a lot of chaos and violence. And later, Napoleon took over France and became the leader, and he made quite a few good decisions for France, but one was not widely accepted. A lot of people didn't like it because it was really expensive and it was quite a big goal and really aggressive. He wanted to take over and conquer the rest of Europe, and he was almost successful. Great Britain was just too powerful, and he just wasn't able to take over Great Britain. And this is what caused, so the French Revolution caused the Napoleonic Wars, which caused impressments. So the Royal Army is the British Army, and it had hardly any men. And there were two main reasons for this. The first was because it was war, and a lot of people don't just want to go and volunteer for war, and just because it's dangerous and you can risk your life for war. And the second was a lot of people didn't want to join because Great Britain was known for having a strict policy, and they had horrible pay and not very good food. So their solution to this problem, that they didn't have any men, was to take men using force. So they took a lot of American men, and the men no longer had a choice if they wanted to join or not. So the British were on a ship called the Leopard, and they forced the U.S. Navy ship Chesapeake to stop. The British sailors were looking for British deserters, and the Leopard stopped the American ship, which was called the Chesapeake, and they tried to take some of their soldiers, but the commander had enough of this, and he wouldn't let them search the ship. So he told them that there weren't any sailors that he could take, and they weren't allowed to come aboard the ship. And the British didn't like this, so they started firing at the Americans, and it resulted in 3 of the crew being dead and many of them injured. And this happened June of 1807. This caused a lot of Americans to become angry, and people started to get riled up for war. And they wanted to fight, but Jefferson, who was the current president, thought that war would be a foolish decision, and he was trying to help America know that it wouldn't be a good idea. But it didn't. They weren't very influenced by his say, so instead he made an act, which I'll talk about on the next slide. So this was the act that Jefferson made in the late months of 1807, so this was right after the incident, because he wanted to do something about this. He wanted to stop soldiers from being taken. So it made it so America could not trade with any of the foreign countries. He wanted not only to stop trade, but he wanted to prevent impressments, because this would prevent ships, the Great Britain ships, from coming into the ports of America. It had pretty bad consequences for American trade. So America had not very many supplies, and because of scarcity, the prices were a lot higher on products and goods. Nobody was able to sell their products to other countries, and a lot of goods that came from other countries weren't available in America. It decreased the popularity of Jefferson because everyone thought that it was his fault, and a lot of people hated him for this decision. One thing I think is kind of sad is 100,000 people lost their jobs, because if they had a job that had to do with trading, they couldn't do anything because of this act. And 50,000 sailors were out of work. A lot of people became in debt because they weren't able to, they didn't have money available. If they sold goods to foreign countries, they weren't able to have that profit, and so they had to, but they weren't able to pay for the goods that they need, so they had to go in debt, and that resulted in them being imprisoned. So before Jefferson left office, he canceled the first act, which was the Embargo Act, and he replaced it with the second act called the Non-Intercourse Act. It allowed Americans to trade with other countries, but there was still an exception. They couldn't trade with France or Great Britain. So you can see at the bottom, I have the flags of France and Great Britain. They were not allowed to trade at any cost with them. It was a little better for the U.S. trade, but it still wasn't wonderful. People weren't able to trade with them, and for some people, like farmers, some of their primary customers were Great Britain, so they lost all of their sales. They were similar because America could not trade at all with Great Britain or France in any way. But the first act, so they were different because the first one said that you couldn't trade with anybody, but the second one said you just can't trade with Great Britain or France. So now they could trade with other countries, except for Great Britain and France. Okay, so
what page is this?
55. So this is how the Native Americans were involved in this. A lot of people, when they think of the War of 1812, they just think of the Americans and the British, but really there was a third group, and this was the Native Americans. So Tecumseh was born in Ohio, and he died in October of 1813, which I'll talk about a little later. And he was a really influential Native American leader. He was a chief and later became a military leader. And he settled a village, and when the settlers came in, they had a lot of conflict because they had different views of property. They had different concepts of it. And so this led to a lot of violence and chaos and a lot of attacks. And he was really affected when a lot of these attacks, one of them killed his father and another killed his one of his admired chiefs. And he wanted to do something about this, so he wanted to stop westward expansion. So that's a really key part. Make sure you have that down. So he wanted to stop westward expansion. So he joined with the British because he figured if the British won, he would be able to keep all of his native land. So right now Americans are trying to move west, and this is the Native American land, and he doesn't want them to take it over. And if he figures if America won, he would lose all of his native land, and he would never be able to have his native land. And one thing that's really important to the Native Americans is that this land is really spiritual to them. It's like their home, and they don't want to leave. So it's really important for them to win this battle. So does everyone have this down? Okay. Okay, so I'm just going to talk about 4 battles that he led. I know there's like not very much room here. So the first one is the Siege of Detroit, and it was a British victory. So it happened August 15th and 16th in 1812, and the Americans started to march into Canada and took over a city that was called Sandwich. And yes, that's an actual city name. And William Hull was the general of the U.S., and he got a message that another fort had been surrendered. So he went back to America to kind of defend. And the British came and attacked Detroit, and this is where the British met up with Tecumseh, and they fought together. And William Hull had received a letter before the British came and said, we have tons of army, we have a big army and lots of Native Americans, and I'm not sure I can control the Native Americans, so I would suggest just surrendering now. And William Hull just didn't want to give up all of a sudden, so he stood strong. But then when they started to march in and he really saw how many people they had, he decided to surrender. So the British now had Detroit. Then the next one is the Battle of Raisin River. This is also called the Battle of Frenchtown. So the United States wanted to get back the Northwest. And this turned into a really high priority for them because they knew that this would be a good land to have, and because it had been taken from the taken from them because of the British. So he prepared all winter, because winter isn't a very good season to have battles in just because of the weather. He was almost ready. He was ready, but it was still winter, and he decided to go for it anyway. So he split his army in 2, and he had a general for each of them. And one half of the group, they went to Frenchtown, and the British heard about this, and they started to take his army with Tecumseh and his warriors, and they went towards Frenchtown as well. So they came and attacked the Americans before they got there, and they killed quite a few of them. I think there was about 700, and so it was there were a lot of Americans that weren't killed, but they were wounded, and the Native Americans, they started killing them, even if they were wounded. And then Tecumseh came and told them to stop. So that ended up being a British victory. The Americans did surrender. So the next one is the Siege of Fort Meigs, and this happened in 1813, in late spring, and the British had a ton of Native Americans still, and they started firing at the Americans' fort, and he sent a message to General Green Clay telling him to send part of his force over the river, and then he had the Native Americans kind of surround the area, but the Americans got through, and they were able to take over the fort so the Native Americans were surrounding it, but they found a spot where the Native Americans weren't covering it, so they were able to get through. So this was an American victory. Then the next battle was where Tecumseh was killed. So they got really slowed down, and the Americans surrounded the British, and they just left them tired and exhausted, and the British ended up surrendering because they were just too tired. Yeah.
So it's kind of like the Battle of Saratoga?
Yeah. So they just left them until basically they were starving and they couldn't do anything.
Can I ask you a question before you leave this page? So when we last did the War of 1812 as a class, this is really a British war. I mean, we're fighting Great Britain because of impressments and whatever. Can you kind of explain to us, why would Tecumseh, why would the natives have any interest in getting involved in another European colonial conflict?
Because this land was so important to them, they really didn't want to lose it just because of what America and British were doing. They wanted to get involved so they wouldn't lose the land that was so important to them.
So the motive for Native Americans, what was it?
It was really their land. They didn't want to lose their land. Okay, so once Tecumseh had sided with the British, he was becoming super strong with them, and like I said, his plans were to stop westward expansion, and they were America was worried that it was actually going to work because he was getting pretty good at this, and they knew that if the British won, the Native Americans would keep their land and they would have no possibility of moving west. And the natives also had an advantage because they were native to this land and they knew it better than the Americans. And the Americans also had to send over a militia to fight them.
Let me point out, because what she said is really critical in leading us into the next part of American history. Tecumseh is from this region of the country. Remember, the original borders of the United States in the Treaty of Paris of 1783 were the Mississippi River right there. Tecumseh represents a native desire to keep everything else. They'd already seen the colonists sweep across the south and northeast coast. They want to make sure they don't take the rest.
Oh, sorry, does everybody have that?
Yes.
Do I need to go back real quick? Yes, Gabe.
Did it ever say how Tecumseh was killed?
Yeah. So, historians don't really know because it was so long ago. But there was a historian, I can't remember who they think it is, but he was killed in the Battle of Thames. And once the Native Americans found out he was dead, they kind of gave up because they realized that without Tecumseh they had no chance in that battle. Okay, so the next part is the Warhawks. They were part of Congress, and they were really young men, and they really wanted, they favored war, and they wanted to help expand America, and they thought war would help us do that, and it would give us more land. So Henry Clay, he is the leader of the Warhawks, and he was really persuasive. This is when he was a little bit older, but during this time he was a lot younger. And he was really good at speeches, so he was good at influencing people. And I think this is kind of interesting. He ran for president 5 times, but never was able to win. I thought that was just an interesting fact about him. And the people who were against the Warhawks, they were the New England Federalists, and they thought that war would be really foolish, especially because we were a young country, and it would just cause more problems.
One other thing I want to point out on this slide, because I've had the opportunity of seeing Savannah's presentation 3 times. She presented this to my other classes last time, but she said Henry Clay was a group of young senators who were the Warhawks. Look at the picture. Does he look like a young guy? No, this is in his older years. Who teaches the lesson on compromise? Does that name sound familiar to you? Because this guy, when it comes to the Civil War, is trying to stop a war. He's the leader of all the guys saying, no, we got to compromise here. We got to compromise here. We can't have war. Do you see his evolution as a person? As a young man, oh yeah, let's go to war with Great Britain. They're taking our soldiers. This is wrong. As an old man, stop war no matter what. We got to compromise on slavery. We got to compromise on land acquisition. Anything to stop a war. And you see his evolution as a person, from a war hawk to a peace hawk, or peace dove, I guess what you'd call it.
Maybe it was to try to help him become president.
May have been. Yeah, as our desires
He did
changes.
run 5 times. And that was
Okay, does everyone have this down?
Thank you, Corey.
Okay, so the United States decided to declare war in 1812, and it ended up that the Federalists were greatly outnumbered, and they kind of had a debate, but eventually the Warhawks just kept pressing, and they were really forceful, and they got James Madison, who was the president at the time, to agree to declare war. So he sent a message to Congress, and they voted in favor for war. So even though America had voted for war, there were still the Federalists who didn't want war, and they started calling it Mr. Madison's War because they thought it was his fault for having the war. Okay. So I think this is kind of interesting. What did Great Britain think? They were still in the Napoleonic Wars, which we talked about last time, and they didn't feel like they had enough money or supplies or men, because they've been taking men from us, to fight with us, and especially because we were overseas, unlike France. But they were a little too late to express that, and war was declared.
Yeah, we were a distraction. Their real war was the Napoleonic Wars.
Yeah. Okay. So this is the Battle of Lake Erie, and it took place September of 1813, and it happened on Lake Erie, and that's kind of near Michigan in this area. And so it was the British and the Americans who were led by Perry, and so Perry took their ships into Put-in Bay, and that's like the western part of Lake Erie, and the Americans started to make a plan, and they were ready to start their plan, but then the British started firing at them, and so they fired back, and they weren't really able to use their plan. And it was getting really tough for America. This battle lasted over 3 hours, which is pretty long. But Perry was determined to get this win, because they had recently had a lot of losses. So when the ship Perry was on was starting to get destroyed, he went in this little boat with some of his men, and they took him to another ship. I think it was called the Niagara, and he fought there, and that resulted in them. They kept firing at the British, and they eventually won. The British surrendered because they were running out of supplies. And this battle was really good for America because it gave them new hope, because like I said, they had recently had a lot of losses, and so it kind of gave them just inspiration to keep on going with this. Sorry, you'll have to write kind of fast just because I'm short on time. So this is the next battle I'm going to talk about. So Washington, D.C. was attacked, like you read in the newspaper, and the British wanted to now attack New Orleans. So they wanted to take over the city, and they wanted to because this would result in them being able to take over the Mississippi River, which is important for like water trades and transportation and a lot of things. And Andrew Jackson, he had been gathering an army, and it was kind of just some random men. There were soldiers, pirates, and there were some of the state militia. And when they heard that the British were coming, they created like this wall. And when the British came, the field was covered in fog, so the Americans couldn't really see them. But then later the fog lifted, and they were totally exposed. and the Americans just started firing at them one by one, and killed like over 2,000 of them. And the amazing thing is the Americans only lost 7 or 8. Some books have said like at the least of 7, some say like 71. There's a lot of different numbers, but the point is that it's really small, and that's not very many, especially compared to 2,000. So this led to Andrew Jackson becoming president. He became like a national hero, and this really stood out for a lot of people, and he was becoming well known. And one thing that's interesting about this, the treaty was actually signed before this battle even happened, so it really had no point. So it's probably good that we didn't lose very many men. Okay. Do I need to go back real quick? Okay. So this is the treaty. Make sure you have all these terms down. Okay. So it was signed in Belgium, and the city was called Ghent, and it was signed in December of 1814. So the terms were that there shall be peace between Great Britain and the United States. And the next ones I think are interesting because kind of did nothing for the war. It said that all territories and places were given back, and all prisoners were given back. So, like, if the British captured land, it was given back to the Americans. So, yeah.
It was a pointless war.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, what they were fighting over impressments, the war ended with Napoleon, and so they stopped impressing our soldiers.
And
so
the
they
treaty
were
really
fighting
never
for it.
talked about impressments at all. So they agreed on a boundary, and they designated the boundary for all the bodies of water. And the last 2 things they didn't do, it was put an end to unfriendly behavior towards Native Americans and restore Native American possessions. They just never did that.
But then why would they? Britain makes a treaty and says, okay, now you got to take care of the natives, and then they leave. Why would they take care of the natives? I mean, they wanted the land, and they had killed the Pan-American Alliance. They'd taken care of Tecumseh, so they killed the resistance to fight back. So at this point, this is a win-win for the Americans. Because they get the natives out of the way, they get the British out of the way, they show that they're, big deal, they can fight the British, and then they're going to sweep across America, which is going to be Austin's story.
Okay, I'm going to move on now, just because of time. Okay, I'll give you 1 more second. Okay, you can get it from a neighbor later if you don't have it. Okay.
This is also being taped, so if you need to pull it offline, it will be available for you.
Okay, so even though this really didn't do a lot, it did create pride for the new nation. And it did, like I said, it launched the career of Andrew Jackson. He did later become the president. And it proved that Great Britain could not destroy America. This one is really important because they felt really strong that Britain couldn't destroy them. And they did gain a national anthem. There was a battle where Francis Scott Key wrote it. I won't talk about that in a whole lot of detail just because of time.
Yeah, I've been to Puerto Rico.
Yeah.
This is home country, huh?
So the Federalists were later called traitors for not wanting the war. And I really like this quote over here. It's from the History Channel. It's, "A young nation defied the odds and won." I really think that's true with this war. And because we were really a young nation, and yeah. Okay. So there wasn't a definite winner, but the Native Americans were definitely the greatest loser. The Americans and the British, they got all their land back, like I said, but the Native Americans didn't get anything. They lost the fight for westward expansion, and they were pushed out of America. Do you want to pass out the iPads? Okay. And then I kind of like this. The British finally started seeing the Americans as citizens instead of rebellious British subjects. They started seeing us as an actual country instead of just being rebellious. Okay, so now we will be playing Kahoo.
Watch your time. I think you're down to about 4.5.
Okay.
So maybe you can get that up and running so they're ready to log in as soon as
Wait, Savannah. Go ahead and launch.
the pin number up there, but you got to start. Game pin if you need to join later.
Oh, I don't know if I talked about this. I think I did.
Oh, shoot.
I like her game, by the way, having watched her make it, because she made it real. Like questions you would actually ask on a test, not just some silly thing.
Where's the music? I can't concentrate without the music.
I know.
So we talked about this one last time. So the Embargo Act was the first one.
And there are walkaway questions about both the Embargo Act and the Non-Intercourse Act, so you need to know those. Hi. Tricky you. I'm like, wait a minute. You're anonymous.
Oh, yes.
Savannah. I love that you guys remember this stuff, because this was last time. It tells me she taught it well if you can remember it.
All of the above.
30 seconds. Ah, I'm not pushing it. Also, make sure you come off.
Hey!
3, 6, 1. I'm in 5th place.
Jess, good job.
Try to answer the question as quick as you can so that we can move on. Okay. Okay.
You pop the mic off, switch it off, and then switch over with Austin. Okay, I need slant in 3, 2, 1. Okay, as we're transitioning here, first of all, would you give Savannah a hand? I am really pleased. She's had to present this now 3 times. Well, actually 4 if we include the time she did it partially in our class and everything crashed on her. Now what I've got for you is I got half this presentation.